Hey guys, tonight we slip through a sandstone gateway just as the sun lowers itself behind mango trees and marble pavilions, and you find yourself standing inside a Mughal garden at sunset. Cool air, long shadows, and the quiet realization that, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this lifestyle without complaining about the insects. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake somewhere in the world right now, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward, sandals brushing over a path of compacted earth edged with red sandstone. The heat of the day still lingers low, like it's forgotten it's supposed to leave, but the air has softened. This is the hour Mughal gardens were made for. Historians agree that these gardens reached their peak during the reigns of emperors like Babur and Shah Jahan, blending Persian design ideals with the realities of the Indian climate. One mainstream fact you can anchor yourself to is that Mughal gardens were not casual green spaces. They were deliberate political and spiritual statements designed to reflect paradise as described in Islamic texts. You don't rush. No one does here, at least not at this hour. The garden seems to instruct you to slow down, gently but firmly, like a hand on your shoulder. You notice the way the paths divide evenly, crossing at right angles. Even without knowing the term charbagh, your body understands the symmetry. 4 parts, 4 directions, order imposed on the wild urge of plants to grow wherever they please. Historians still argue whether this rigid geometry was more about spiritual symbolism or imperial control, but as you walk, it mostly feels calming, like the world briefly makes sense. To your left, water murmurs. Not a dramatic fountain yet, just a narrow channel, its surface catching the last orange light of the sun. The sound is soft enough that you almost miss it, which is the point. Mughal engineers were famously skilled at hydraulic design, using gravity-fed systems to move water long distances without pumps. A quirky tidbit you might enjoy as you wander: some garden channels were angled so precisely that the water would ripple just enough to cool the air, but not enough to splash. Ancient air conditioning minus the electric bill. You pause near the entrance pavilion and glance back once, instinctively, as if someone would stop you. No guard does. Security exists here, but it's subtle. That's for later. For now, the garden accepts you. The light is fading quickly, turning white marble faintly blue, then gray. You hear distant voices, low and unhurried, and the occasional cough that echoes longer than expected. Sound behaves differently in a space designed to carry poetry, not traffic. As you walk deeper, scent becomes more noticeable than sight. Warm earth, crushed leaves, something floral you can't immediately name. Roses were popular here, of course, but not just for looking at. Mainstream history tells us roses were cultivated extensively for making attar, a concentrated perfume oil. The quirky part is that some gardeners swore certain rose varieties smelled stronger after sunset, leading to selective nighttime harvesting. Historians still argue whether this belief had a botanical basis or was simply confirmation bias paired with tired noses. You shift your weight, feeling the faint ache of standing all day, except you haven't. The garden makes you aware of your body in small ways. The path is even, but not smooth. Pebbles press gently into your soles. Somewhere nearby, a peacock calls, the sound oddly mournful, like it'd forgotten what it wanted to say halfway through. Peacocks, by the way, were often kept semi-free in Mughal gardens. Not pets exactly, more like tolerated residents. One chronicler complained they screamed too much at night, which feels relatable. You pass a low wall and notice how it frames the horizon. This is intentional. Mughal architects loved controlled views, windows, arches, and openings that turned the landscape into something like a painting. Even now, with the sun almost gone, the sky appears carefully placed. Orange fades into purple, purple into a soft, indecisive blue. Historians still argue whether garden designers worked closely with astronomers to align these views with celestial events, or if that's us projecting modern romanticism backward. There's a bench ahead, stone and cool, and you sit without ceremony. Somewhere unseen, gardeners are finishing their work, sweeping paths, closing small sluice gates. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that maintaining these gardens required a permanent workforce. This wasn't passive beauty, it was labor-intensive, seasonal, and continuous. A fringe tidbit whispers that some gardeners believed the plants listened, and that harsh words spoken near flowers could stunt growth. So, work ended quietly at dusk, when voices naturally softened. You lean back slightly and look up. Tree canopies overlap just enough to break the sky into manageable pieces. Bats flicker through the air, efficient and silent, doing the real work of insect control. No one comments on them. You appreciate that. The garden isn't trying to impress you anymore. The daytime visitors are gone. This hour belongs to those who stay. A breeze moves through, bringing with it the faint clink of water touching stone. You realize you're smiling, faintly, without meaning to. This place does that. It's designed to. Whether as propaganda, prayer, or pleasure, the Mughal garden succeeds by slowing you down. Historians still argue whether emperors experienced these spaces as spiritual retreats or as stages for power, but sitting here, you suspect the answer was probably both, depending on the day. You stand again, unhurried, and continue inward as the last edge of sun slips away completely. The garden doesn't end at the gate, it deepens. And you follow, because at this pace, there's nowhere else you need to be. You keep moving, and without anyone pointing it out, your feet begin to follow the logic of the garden. The paths don't wander, they don't curve whimsically or surprise you with sudden turns. Instead, they stretch out straight and deliberate, intersecting at right angles like a calm diagram drawn directly onto the earth. This is the charbagh layout asserting itself, though no one here uses the word casually. You simply feel it, order underfoot, reassurance in geometry. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this moment is that Mughal gardens were modeled on Persian garden traditions, themselves inspired by ancient ideas of paradise divided into 4 parts. 4 rivers, 4 directions, 4 elements. Pick your symbolic framework, and it probably fits. Historians still argue whether the charbagh was meant primarily as a literal representation of the Quranic paradise or as a flexible aesthetic system that emperors used however they pleased. As you walk, it feels less like doctrine and more like choreography. You're being guided without being pushed. The path beneath you is slightly raised, just enough to stay dry when water spills over from irrigation channels. Someone thought about that centuries ago. You imagine a court engineer squinting at the ground, arguing politely with an architect about slope angles, while everyone pretends this isn't about ego. A quirky tidbit floats in here. Some Mughal engineers tested garden layouts by releasing dyed water to see how evenly it flowed, adjusting paths until the colors spread symmetrically. You briefly picture this turning into a mess and then into a very calm, very formal argument. As dusk deepens, the straight paths begin to feel longer than they are. Perspective plays tricks when everything lines up. The far pavilion looks close enough to reach in a dozen steps, but it takes more. You're not annoyed. This is the point. The garden stretches time, gently, like warm dough. You notice that walking here encourages a steady pace, not too slow, not rushed, a pace that would make a modern fitness tracker very confused. On either side of the path, planting beds sit slightly lower, framed by stone borders. You glance down and see leaves catching the last scraps of light. Some plants are trimmed into obedient shapes, others spill just enough to remind you they're alive. Historians still argue whether Mughal gardeners preferred strict control or tolerated selective wildness. Standing here, it seems like a negotiation. The plants behave, mostly, and the humans pretend this was their plan all along. You reach an intersection where four paths meet, and you pause without thinking. These crossings are the garden's punctuation marks. From here, you can choose any direction and still feel oriented. It's hard to get lost in a charbagh, which may or may not be symbolic of moral clarity, depending on how philosophical you're feeling tonight. A small stone platform sits at the center, worn smooth. Someone once stood here regularly. Maybe an emperor, maybe a caretaker, maybe a bored teenager waiting for instructions. Water crosses your path at this junction, flowing in a narrow channel that divides the space cleanly. You step over it easily. The sound shifts slightly depending on where you stand, louder at the center, quieter near the edges. Mughal designers were attentive to acoustics, even if they didn't describe it that way. One fringe story claims certain gardens were tuned so footsteps and water created pleasing rhythms together. Historians still argue whether that's true or just a poetic exaggeration that got repeated too many times. You continue straight, because of course you do. The path leads your gaze forward toward a pavilion whose arches frame the dimming sky. The structure doesn't loom, it waits. This alignment isn't accidental. Mainstream scholarship points out that key features, pavilions, tombs, platforms, were placed along central axes to reinforce symmetry and hierarchy. You're always aware of what matters most here, even if no one explains it. As you walk, you notice how the garden seems to edit your thoughts. Distractions fall away. You stop mentally checking imaginary lists. The straight lines leave less room for mental wandering. It's oddly soothing, though part of you suspects that's exactly how imperial power liked it. Historians still argue whether gardens like this were tools of soft control, training bodies and minds to accept order as beauty. You file that away for later, when you're not this relaxed. A faint breeze runs along the path, unobstructed by curves. It carries the scent of water and leaves directly to you, efficient and polite. Somewhere behind you, a peacock screams again, because tranquility is never total. You smile to yourself. Even paradise has complaints. You pass another intersection, then another, each one familiar enough that you don't need to stop anymore. Your body learns the pattern. The garden isn't boring, it's predictable, and that's different. Predictability lets you rest. You realize this space was designed not just to impress visitors, but to give regular occupants, emperors, courtiers, servants, a mental exhale at the end of the day. The stone beneath your feet holds the day's warmth, releasing it slowly upward. It's subtle, but you feel it through your soles. Mughal builders chose materials carefully, understanding how stone, water, and shade worked together to manage temperature. A quirky aside, some stones were reportedly selected because they stayed cooler at night, though historians still argue whether this was deliberate science or fortunate coincidence. As twilight deepens, lanterns are not yet lit. The paths remain visible just long enough. You sense the garden transitioning modes from visual spectacle to something quieter, more internal. Straight lines fade into soft outlines, but the structure remains. You don't need to see every edge to know where you are. You slow again, not because the path demands it, but because you're ready. The geometry has done its work. You're centered, oriented, and gently emptied of urgency. And as you move forward along one last straight stretch, the garden opens itself further, ready to show you what comes next. You begin to notice that the garden has a soundtrack, and now that the sun is gone, it steps forward. Water becomes the dominant voice. Not loud, not insistent, just present, threading through the space like a thought you don't quite finish. You follow one of the narrow channels, walking beside it as if the two of you have agreed to keep each other company for a while. The mainstream historical fact grounding this moment is that Mughal gardens relied on sophisticated water management systems, often bringing water from distant sources using gravity-fed aqueducts, underground pipes, and carefully calculated gradients. No pumps, no engines, just patience, math, and a refusal to accept good enough. Historians still argue whether these systems were adapted locally by Indian engineers or imposed from Persian traditions and refined over time. As you listen, it feels less like an argument and more like a collaboration stretched across generations. The channel beside you is shallow, its stone edges worn smooth by centuries of flow. You crouch slightly and watch the surface catch the last reflections of lantern light from somewhere ahead. The water isn't rushing. It moves at a speed that suggests confidence. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some Mughal texts describe water as the moving mirror of the garden, meant to reflect architecture, sky, and people in equal measure. You resist the urge to check your reflection, partly because it's dark, and partly because this feels like a place where vanity would be gently judged. Every few steps, the channel changes pitch. A small drop, barely noticeable, creates a soft, repetitive note. This is intentional. Mughal designers created charbagh, sloped stone surfaces where water slid thinly, producing a continuous, calming sound. Mainstream historians agree these features cooled the air through evaporation, but historians still argue whether the sound itself was considered equally important. Standing here, listening, it's hard to believe it wasn't. You continue walking, matching your pace to the water's rhythm. It's impossible not to. The sound pulls you into sync, slowing your breathing without asking permission. You pass a small square pool where the channel widens, the water settling briefly before continuing on. These pools act like pauses in a sentence. You stop beside it, leaning slightly forward, hands resting on your knees. The surface is dark now, but you can still make out faint ripples. Somewhere above, a pavilion casts a rectangular shadow across the pool, perfectly aligned. Historians still argue whether these alignments were symbolic, practical, or simply aesthetically pleasing. You suspect the answer is yes. Mughal design rarely chose just one reason when it could have three. A breeze crosses the pool and carries cool air toward you. You feel it on your ankles first, then your calves. This is the garden doing its quiet work. Water, shade, stone, and open space combine to create a microclimate noticeably cooler than the world outside the walls. A fringe tidbit claims some visitors thought this cooling effect was magical. Others, more practically, wrote long explanations involving airflow and evaporation. Historians still argue which group was more convincing. You straighten and continue along the channel as it narrows again, slipping beneath a small stone bridge. You step over it, barely noticing the transition. Above the bridge, the water makes a slightly brighter sound, echoing faintly under the arch. You pause, then step back once just to hear it again. You don't know why. The garden encourages these small, pointless pleasures. Farther along, the channel splits, feeding two directions at once. You watch for a moment as the water divides itself evenly, or nearly so. It's satisfying in a way that's hard to explain. Engineers spent serious time ensuring these splits were balanced, because uneven flow could disrupt the symmetry of the entire garden. Historians still argue how precise these systems really were, given erosion and maintenance challenges, but right now it looks perfect. You glance up and notice stars beginning to appear, faint and tentative. The water reflects them briefly before they vanish again, broken by ripples. You're aware of time passing, but it doesn't feel urgent. This is evening water, not morning water. It doesn't hurry. You remember reading, somewhere, that Mughal emperors preferred to walk their gardens at this hour, when the heat faded and the court quieted. Whether that's universally true or selectively romanticized is still debated, but it feels plausible. You pass a gardener kneeling near a sluice gate, adjusting a small wooden panel. He moves slowly, carefully, as if the water might take offense if rushed. This is maintenance as ritual. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that water levels had to be adjusted daily, even hourly, depending on temperature and use. A quirky belief among some workers held that water remembered its path, and sudden changes could confuse it. You file that under charming but unlikely, while still appreciating the care. As you walk on, the channel grows quieter, the sound thinning as it stretches toward the garden's edge. The water doesn't disappear, it just becomes less audible, absorbed into the broader hush of night. You realize how much you've been leaning on it mentally. Its constancy has anchored you through the fading light. You stop once more, standing still, listening to what remains. A distant trickle, leaves shifting, the occasional indignant peacock. The garden has moved you from sight to sound without you noticing the transition. Historians still argue whether Mughal gardens were designed to be experienced sequentially, first visually, then sensorially, but your body says yes. You take a breath, slow and deep, and step away from the channel, carrying its rhythm with you as you move onward into the darker, quieter heart of the garden. You walk on, and even without seeing anyone important, you feel it. The faint pressure of authority lingering in the air, like a scent that hasn't fully faded. The emperor is not here tonight. No procession, no silken canopies, no murmured announcements rippling ahead of his arrival. And yet everything around you seems arranged as if he might appear at any moment. The garden holds itself ready. This is one of the quieter truths of Mughal power. Mainstream historians agree that gardens were extensions of imperial identity, carefully curated spaces where the emperor's taste, discipline, and worldview were made physical. Even in absence, the ruler was present through design. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional psychological strategy or simply a byproduct of centralized patronage, but as you move through the space, it's hard not to feel watched, not by guards, but by expectations. You pass a marble platform slightly raised above the path. It's empty now, cool and pale in the fading light. This is the sort of place an emperor might sit, elevated just enough to see without being obvious. You imagine Shah Jahan here, or perhaps Jahangir, reclining with a book or a cup of sherbet, pretending to relax while actually observing everything. A quirky anecdote survives in court writings. One emperor reportedly enjoyed sitting silently in his garden just to see how people behaved when they thought he wasn't paying attention. Historians still argue whether this story is apocryphal or uncomfortably accurate. You sit briefly on the platform, then stand again, suddenly aware that lingering might feel inappropriate even centuries later. Power has a way of sticking to places. The garden's symmetry reinforces this feeling. Every path leads somewhere meaningful. Every feature seems accounted for. Nothing feels accidental. You don't feel oppressed exactly, just gently contained. As darkness thickens, the garden's restraint becomes more noticeable. There are no wild bursts of color now, no dramatic shadows. The space feels disciplined, almost reserved. This mirrors Mughal court culture itself, which valued controlled behavior, measured speech, and carefully staged emotion. Mainstream history tells us court etiquette was strict, sometimes exhausting so. A fringe tidbit suggests that some courtiers preferred the garden specifically because it allowed them to relax without fully abandoning decorum. You could be informal here, but only within reason. You walk past a cluster of low shrubs trimmed into neat forms. They look almost identical, which you find oddly comforting. Individuality is not the goal here. Harmony is. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on uniformity reflected imperial ideology or simply aesthetic preference, but tonight it reads as reassurance. Everything has its place, including you, temporarily. The absence of the emperor also shifts how others move through the garden. Servants walk more freely now, though still quietly. You see one pause to adjust a cushion on a stone bench, another straighten a small tray left behind. These gestures aren't hurried, there's no need to impress. One mainstream fact often forgotten is that imperial gardens were lived-in spaces, not frozen displays. People worked, rested, talked, and waited here. A quirky aside, Some servants reportedly developed favorite corners of the garden, places they claimed felt lighter somehow. Historians still argue whether that was superstition or simply personal comfort. You stop near a reflecting pool and look into the dark surface. The stars are clearer now, and for a moment they seem closer here than anywhere else. The emperor, absent though he is, once used this same pool as a mirror for the sky. That thought makes you feel very small, but not in a bad way, more like gently resized. A faint laugh drifts from somewhere beyond the trees, quickly hushed. The rules are relaxed now, but not gone. This is the garden's in-between hour, when authority softens but doesn't disappear. You imagine how different this place would feel during the day, brighter, louder, more performative. At night, it belongs to quieter versions of its occupants. You resume walking, aware that you're moving through a space shaped by someone who believed order itself was beautiful, even divine. Historians still argue whether Mughal emperors saw themselves as stewards of paradise or simply very wealthy men with excellent landscapers. As you move deeper into the garden, you suspect they didn't see a contradiction. The emperor may be absent, but his shadow remains, stretched long and thin across the paths, guiding your steps without touching you. And somehow, that makes the quiet feel heavier, richer, more complete. You notice the gardeners before you fully see them, their presence announced by small, methodical sounds. The soft scrape of a broom against stone, the muted clink of a metal tool set carefully down, the gentle cough of someone who has worked all day and is still not quite finished. This is the garden's evening shift, the hour when maintenance blends into ritual. You slow instinctively, matching their pace, because rushing past would feel rude. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. Mughal gardens required constant upkeep, carried out by specialized workers who understood plants, water systems, and seasonal rhythms in intimate detail. These were not interchangeable laborers. Many gardeners inherited their roles, learning the garden as one learns a language. Historians still argue whether their status was closer to skilled artisans or invisible servants, but watching them now, it's clear their knowledge ran deep. One gardener kneels near a bed of low flowers, trimming with deliberate care. He doesn't rush to finish before night fully falls. Instead, he works until the light tells him to stop. A quirky tidbit recorded in later accounts claims some gardeners believed cutting plants after full dark could confuse their growth. Whether botanical science agrees is another matter, but the practice persisted. Historians still argue whether such beliefs influenced official gardening schedules or simply coexisted with practical constraints. You step aside as another worker passes, carrying a wooden bucket balanced effortlessly on one hip. Water sloshes softly but never spills. The bucket smells faintly of damp earth and leaves. You realize these gardeners have been managing water all day, redirecting flow, clearing debris, adjusting channels so that tonight's calm could exist. The garden's tranquility is earned, not accidental. A small group gathers briefly near a path intersection, exchanging a few quiet words. Their voices stay low, not because they're forbidden to speak, but because loudness feels out of place here. This is the end of their workday, but also the moment when the garden is most itself. Mainstream sources note that Mughal gardens were often enjoyed most in the evening, after labor had shaped them into readiness. You're witnessing the final touches. One gardener pauses to sweep fallen petals from a walkway. He moves them not into a pile, but gently off the path and into the soil, returning them where they belong. This small act feels ceremonial. A fringe belief held that leaving petals on paths invited bad luck, especially at night. Historians still argue whether this superstition was widespread or localized, but the care is real either way. You watch hands at work, calloused, steady, practiced. These are hands that know exactly how much pressure to apply, how much to remove, when to stop. The garden is not wild here. It is negotiated. Plants are allowed to live, but within boundaries. You find that oddly comforting. Someone is paying attention. As darkness deepens, the gardeners begin to withdraw, one by one, tools collected, paths left immaculate. The garden doesn't feel abandoned. It feels set, like a room prepared for sleep. You take a breath and realize how quiet it has become now that the work sounds have faded. The water resumes its role as the primary voice. You move on, carrying with you the sense that what you're enjoying is the result of countless small, careful decisions made by people who will never be named. Historians still argue how much agency these workers had in shaping the garden's design over time, but tonight their influence feels undeniable. The path ahead opens, clear and ready, as if the garden itself is thanking them and you for moving slowly enough to notice. You drift onward, and the garden subtly shifts its focus. Where earlier it guided your feet and ears, now it draws your attention to scent. The air thickens just slightly, not heavy, but layered, like someone has turned down the lights and turned up the aroma. This is the hour these flowers have been waiting for. Daytime was merely rehearsal. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Mughal gardeners deliberately selected and cultivated plants for their fragrance, especially those that released scent in the evening. Visual beauty mattered, but scent carried deeper associations with paradise, memory, and intimacy. Historians still argue whether fragrance was prioritized equally across all imperial gardens or reserved for more private spaces. But here, at sunset, it feels central. You pass a cluster of jasmine, their small, pale blossoms nearly invisible now, but unmistakable in smell. The scent moves ahead of you, announcing the plant before you reach it. You slow, partly to enjoy it, partly because your brain is suddenly busy pulling up half-forgotten associations. Gardens like this worked on memory as much as senses. A quirky tidbit from later Mughal writings suggests some courtiers claimed certain flower scents improved concentration during poetry recitation. Historians still argue whether that's poetic metaphor or early aerotherapy. Roses appear again, darker varieties this time, their color deepening into something almost black in the low light. These are not the bright, cheerful roses of a daytime painting. These are serious roses. You lean in slightly and catch their scent, richer now, less sharp than earlier. Rose cultivation was extensive in Mughal domains, not only for gardens but for producing rosewater and ottar. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that some imperial gardens functioned partly as experimental plots, testing which varieties thrived best under specific conditions. As you move, the scents overlap. Jasmine giving way to tuberose, then something greener, almost grassy. The transitions are gradual, never abrupt. This wasn't accidental. Gardeners arranged plantings so fragrances unfolded in sequence as you walked. Historians still argue whether this sequencing was planned formally or evolved organically over time, but the effect is unmistakable. You are being led by your nose now. A faint hint of something medicinal drifts in, perhaps basil or another herb planted near the beds. Some Mughal gardens included useful plants alongside ornamental ones. A fringe tidbit claims certain emperors preferred gardens that could supply both pleasure and remedies. Whether that was practical foresight or symbolic self-sufficiency is still debated, but you like the idea of a ruler who wanted his paradise to double as a pharmacy. You pause near a low hedge, breathing in slowly. The air feels cooler here, heavier with moisture and scent. You imagine how overwhelming this might have been for visitors unfamiliar with such concentrated scent. Some foreign travelers wrote of gardens that were too perfumed, which feels like a very polite complaint. Historians still argue whether scent preferences varied significantly between cultures or individuals, but you suspect even then, some people just wanted less jasmine in their personal space. A breeze moves through again, stirring leaves and redistributing scent like an invisible hand. For a moment, everything blends. Flowers, damp soil, water, stone warmed by the day. You're aware of your breathing now, how it has slowed to match the garden's pace. This is not accidental relaxation. This is design doing quiet work. You resume walking, noticing how scent lingers even after you pass a planting bed. It trails behind you, fading gradually, like a thought you don't need to finish. The garden doesn't rush you forward. It lets impressions dissolve at their own speed. Somewhere nearby, a lantern is being lit, the faint smell of oil briefly cutting through the flowers. It doesn't ruin the effect, it adds to it. The garden accommodates layers. Historians still argue whether Mughal designers consciously thought in terms of sensory layering or simply followed traditions that produced this effect naturally. Either way, the result feels intentional enough to trust. You take one more deep breath, letting the scents settle, and continue on, carrying a little of the garden with you, inhaled and remembered, as night continues to gather gently around the paths. The air changes again as you move forward, though this time it's not the plants announcing themselves, it's the subtle human urge to improve upon them. You begin to notice small ceramic jars, copper vessels, and cloth-wrapped bundles tucked discreetly near benches and pavilions. This is where scent stops being purely botanical and becomes curated. Perfume enters the conversation. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. The Mughal court was deeply invested in perfumery, especially the production of attar, highly concentrated essential oils distilled from flowers like rose, jasmine, and keda. These were not casual fragrances. They were status symbols, diplomatic gifts, and personal signatures. Historians still argue whether Mughal perfumery was more influenced by Persian traditions or developed into a distinct South Asian craft. But either way, the expertise was formidable. You pass a low table where a servant carefully seals a small glass vial, its contents catching lantern light for just a second. The scent drifting from it is deeper and more complex than the flowers alone, warmer, almost honeyed. This is attar that has been aging, allowed to mature so its notes settle and blend. A quirky tidbit from period accounts claims some otters were aged for years, even decades, becoming family heirlooms. Historians still argue how widespread this practice really was, but the idea of inherited perfume feels oddly intimate. The air around you now carries layered intention. Someone wanted this moment to smell exactly like this. You imagine courtiers dabbing tiny amounts behind their ears or onto sleeves, careful not to overdo it. Overuse was frowned upon. Perfume was meant to whisper, not announce. You appreciate that philosophy. Modern scent marketing could learn a thing or two. As you walk, you notice how perfume interacts with the garden rather than replacing it. Floral notes echo nearby blossoms, while earthier bases blend into the smell of soil and stone. The effect is seamless. Historians still argue whether these blends were designed to harmonize with specific gardens or chosen purely for personal taste, but standing here, it feels coordinated, like the garden itself is wearing perfume. You pause near a pavilion where cushions are arranged neatly on a marble floor. Someone has sprinkled rosewater lightly across the stone, just enough that it cools the air as it evaporates. This practice was common in Mughal settings, especially in the evening. Mainstream sources note rosewater was used for cooling, hygiene, and hospitality. A fringe belief suggested it also purified the space spiritually. Historians still argue whether this belief was symbolic or sincerely held, but the cooling effect alone makes it worthwhile. The scent here is gentler, less layered, and you realize this area is meant for rest rather than display. Perfume becomes softer in private spaces. You sit briefly, inhaling slowly, and feel the day finally loosen its grip on you. The garden has guided you from geometry to water to flowers, and now to something almost intangible, atmosphere shaped by human hands. A servant passes quietly, carrying a cloth-wrapped tray of small bottles. You catch a fleeting blend of sandalwood and something citrusy before it fades. Sandalwood was prized not only for its scent, but for its supposed calming properties. Historians still argue whether these effects were psychological or physiological, but you don't particularly care. Calm is calm. You stand again, aware that scent now lingers differently. Flowers fade in and out, but perfume clings lightly, following people as they move. It personalizes the garden, turning a shared space into something momentarily individual. For all its symmetry and order, the garden allows this softness. As you continue on, the curated scents thin gradually, giving way once more to the simpler smells of night. Cool air, water, leaves. The perfumes don't disappear. They settle into the background, becoming part of the garden's memory. You carry a trace of them with you, even as the path leads onward, deeper into the quiet. You hear them before you see them. Soft voices, measured and unhurried, drifting through the trees like another layer of evening sound. The tone is calm but engaged, the cadence unmistakable. These are not idle conversations. These are debates, the kind that stretch comfortably without urgency, because no one is trying to win quickly. You slow as you approach, not out of caution, but respect. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens often functioned as informal intellectual spaces where scholars, poets, astronomers, and courtiers gathered to discuss ideas. The garden provided a neutral, calming environment that encouraged reflection and conversation. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were spontaneous or subtly orchestrated by court culture, but either way, the garden supported them naturally. You stop just outside a small circle of men seated on low cushions beneath a tree. Their faces are half lit by a nearby oil lamp, shadows softening features rather than obscuring them. One gestures slowly as he speaks, tracing an invisible arc in the air. You catch fragments, stars, numbers, metaphors, a reference to a poem you don't recognize. No one raises their voice. Disagreement here is gentle, almost affectionate. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some Mughal scholars believed that discussing complex ideas outdoors, especially near water and greenery, sharpened the mind. They argued that enclosed spaces trapped stale thoughts. Historians still argue whether this belief influenced where debates were held or if it simply justified a preference for pleasant settings. Sitting nearby, you find it hard to argue with the logic. The conversation shifts, and now you hear mention of the heavens. Astronomy was a serious pursuit at the Mughal court, tied closely to astrology, timekeeping, and imperial legitimacy. Mainstream history tells us emperors like Jahangir and Shah Jahan patronized scholars who studied celestial movements. Historians still argue how much emperors themselves understood the science versus the symbolism, but the interest was real. One man pauses, looking up through the branches as if the stars might answer him directly. Another counters gently, smiling as he does. This is not confrontation. This is shared curiosity. You realize how different this feels from modern debate, which often seems designed to exhaust rather than explore. Here, disagreement feels like a long walk, not a sprint. You shift your weight, listening without intruding. No one acknowledges you, but no one seems bothered by your presence either. Gardens like this blurred social boundaries slightly. Outside formal halls, hierarchy softened. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or incidental, but it allowed ideas to circulate more freely, at least among those permitted to be here. The topic drifts again, this time toward poetry. Someone recites a couplet quietly, letting the words hang in the air before explaining his interpretation. Another nods, then offers a different reading. The garden absorbs it all, the words, the pauses, the thoughtful silences between responses. You notice how the natural sounds fill gaps without interrupting, water and leaves stepping in where speech rests. A fringe anecdote claims some poets tested verses aloud in gardens to see how they sounded against running water. If the lines clashed with the rhythm, they revised them. Historians still argue whether this actually happened or if it's a romantic story added later, but you like the idea of poetry being edited for acoustics. As the discussion continues, you begin to drift again, careful not to disturb. You carry the feeling with you, the sense that this garden is not just a place to walk, but a place to think slowly. The debates fade behind you, replaced once more by water and leaves, but the calm intensity lingers. You realize that this space holds minds as gently as it holds bodies, and as you move on, the garden seems to invite your own thoughts to settle, unchallenged, unhurried, ready for whatever quiet reflection comes next. As you move farther from the soft murmur of scholarly debate, another sound takes over. Birds. Not the bright, chaotic chatter of daytime, but something more selective. Calls echo briefly, then stop, as if each bird is testing whether it's worth speaking up. You tilt your head, listening, and realize the garden holds two kinds of birds, those who belong to the night and those who are about to surrender to it. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens often housed birds both free and caged, prized for their beauty, song, or symbolic meaning. Birds were considered markers of refinement, and certain species, nightingales, parrots, and bulbuls, were especially valued. Historians still argue whether these birds were kept primarily for pleasure or for their poetic and symbolic associations, but the answer likely varies by species and owner. You hear a flutter from above and glimpse a bird settling into the branches, its movements quick and efficient. Free birds come and go as they please, taking advantage of water, shelter, and relative safety. The garden's design discourages predators, and human presence adds another layer of protection. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some chroniclers claimed certain birds returned to the same garden year after year, becoming unofficial residents. Historians still argue whether this was true loyalty or simply convenient habitat reuse. A little farther on, you notice a wooden structure partially hidden behind foliage. It's a bird enclosure, elegant rather than ostentatious, its latticework allowing air and sound to pass through freely. Inside, shapes shift. These birds are quieter now, their daytime songs replaced by occasional rustles. You feel a slight tension here, the contrast between freedom and containment. Caged birds were common in Mughal settings, but their treatment varied. Mainstream history notes that prized birds were often kept in spacious enclosures and cared for meticulously. A fringe belief held that birds sang better when treated kindly and placed near water. Historians still argue how much of this was genuine concern versus aesthetic self-interest. Standing here, you sense both. One bird calls softly from within the enclosure, a brief, questioning note. It doesn't echo far. The garden absorbs it. You imagine how this sound might have been enjoyed during the day, a pleasant accent to conversation. At night, it feels more intimate, almost private. You linger, listening, until the bird settles again. You move on, and the soundscape shifts once more. Free birds take over, their calls sparse but confident. Somewhere, an owl hoots, low and deliberate. You smile faintly. Even in carefully controlled spaces, Some things remain beyond management. The owl does not care about symmetry. You notice that the garden seems designed to amplify certain sounds and soften others. Birdsong carries just far enough to be noticed, never overwhelming. Historians still argue whether Mughal designers consciously considered acoustic ecology, how animals and architecture interact sonically, but the balance feels intentional. As you walk, you catch sight of a peacock perched surprisingly high, its long tail draped awkwardly over a branch. It looks uncomfortable, but dignified about it. Peacocks were both admired and tolerated, their loud calls accepted as the price of beauty. A fringe anecdote claimed some gardeners attempted to relocate especially noisy peacocks, only for them to return stubbornly. Historians still argue whether peacocks were ever truly managed or simply endured. The garden grows darker now, and bird shapes become silhouettes. Sound becomes your guide again. You step carefully, aware of how your own movements add to the quiet. Even your footsteps feel louder here, and you adjust instinctively, placing your feet more gently. You realize that the garden is teaching you how to behave without instruction. Listen, pause, move slowly. Let sounds exist without chasing them. The birds do the same. Those who need to speak do so briefly. The rest wait. You take one last look toward the enclosure, then continue along the path, carrying with you the layered silence of wings, calls, and the gentle agreement between nature and design that defines this place at night. You don't see them at first, and that's the point. As you move along the path, the garden presents you with walls that are not quite walls. Screens of carved stone, latticed so finely they seem more air than barrier. Light filters through them in soft fragments, breaking lantern glow into delicate patterns on the ground. You slow, realizing this is a space designed for watching without being watched. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal architecture frequently employed jolly screens, intricately carved stone lattices, especially in spaces associated with women of the court. These screens allowed visibility, airflow, and participation without direct exposure. Historians still argue whether jolly were primarily tools of seclusion or sophisticated devices for controlled interaction, but as you stand here, they feel like both. Behind one screen, you catch a hint of movement, a shift of fabric, a soft laugh quickly contained. You don't stare. It feels wrong, like eavesdropping on a thought. Women of the Mughal court often experienced the garden differently from men, not absent from it, but partially veiled, their presence filtered through architecture. A quirky tidbit survives in travel accounts claiming some women could identify visitors by their footsteps alone, having spent so much time observing from behind screens. Historians still argue whether this was exaggerated, but it's easy to imagine. You walk past another jolly, this one overlooking a small courtyard planted with low shrubs and a single tree. The view is framed perfectly from the inside, you realize. Whoever stands there sees the garden arranged just for them. Mainstream history tells us that women of the imperial household were often highly educated, engaging in poetry, patronage, and politics, even indirectly. The garden provided a space where observation could become influence. A soft voice drifts through the lattice, barely audible, followed by the faint sound of bangles brushing together. It's intimate, domestic, entirely at odds with the grand symbolism you've been immersed in. The garden accommodates this too. Historians still argue how much autonomy women exercised within these spaces, but moments like this suggest lived complexity beyond strict rules. You notice how the screens cast patterned shadows across the path, shifting slightly as lanterns flicker. You step through one, and the pattern dissolves, replaced by open space again. The transition is seamless. Inclusion and exclusion here are not binary, they're gradients. As you move on, the screens recede and the path opens. You carry with you the awareness that the garden is layered with lives you only partially glimpse, and somehow that partial view feels appropriate. The garden doesn't demand full access, it invites quiet acknowledgement and continued walking. You follow the path as it widens slightly, and the mood shifts again, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. The scent of flowers thins, replaced by something sweeter, cooler, faintly edible. You hear the soft clink of metal against ceramic, the careful sound of preparation rather than service. This part of the garden is thinking about refreshment. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Mughal courts placed enormous emphasis on cooling drinks, especially in the evening. Sherbets made from fruit, flowers, and herbs were common, as was tea in various forms, though not always in the way you might expect today. These drinks weren't indulgences so much as survival strategies in a warm climate. Historians still argue whether tea arrived earlier through Central Asian influence or later through trade routes, but cooling beverages of all kinds were essential. You pause near a low pavilion where servants work quietly. Copper vessels sit half submerged in a shallow trough of water, using evaporation to keep their contents cool. This is low-tech brilliance at its finest. A quirky tidbit from period accounts suggests some kitchens used porous clay containers that sweated as water evaporated, chilling the drink inside. Historians still argue whether this method was widespread or reserved for elite settings, but it clearly works. You feel cooler just standing nearby. A servant lifts a ladle slowly, pours, then pauses, watching the surface settle before moving again. No rushing. Evening drinks are meant to calm, not excite. You catch a whiff of something citrusy, perhaps lemon or orange blossom, followed by rose again, always rose. Sherbet recipes varied wildly, some sweet, some tart, some medicinal. A fringe belief held that certain sherbets balanced the body's humors. Historians still argue how seriously this framework was taken versus used as polite explanation for preference. You accept a small cup without ceremony. It's cool against your fingers, condensation gathering almost instantly. You sip carefully. The drink is light, refreshing, subtly floral, with just enough sweetness to feel restorative rather than indulgent. You imagine how different this would feel after a full day in the sun. The garden has prepared you for this moment, slowed you down so you can actually taste it. Nearby, a tray holds small bowls of crushed ice wrapped in cloth. Ice here. It feels improbable, but Mughal courts famously used ice hauled from mountains or stored in ice houses. Mainstream historians confirm that ice was transported over long distances for imperial use. A quirky aside claims some courtiers complained about watered-down drinks when ice melted too quickly. Historians still argue whether that complaint was sincere or just someone being difficult for sport. You finish the drink slowly, resisting the urge to ask for more. It's not that kind of place. One is enough. The act is as important as the refreshment itself. You hand the cup back, and it disappears quietly, like it was never there. As you move on, the lingering coolness stays with you, spreading outward from your chest. The garden seems to approve. This is how evenings are meant to unfold here. Walk, pause, sip, continue. No rush, no excess. You step away from the pavilion, carrying the taste with you as the path leads onward, deeper into the evening, where the garden's calm only grows stronger. You notice the shift almost immediately, not in the garden itself, but in the way certain people move through it. Their steps are careful, a fraction too deliberate, their heads turning just a bit longer at arches, water channels, and trees. These are not locals. These are visitors, foreign ones, doing their best to look relaxed while mentally cataloging everything they see. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens were frequent stopping points for foreign envoys, traders, missionaries, and travelers. These spaces were used to impress without overwhelming, to demonstrate refinement, order, and wealth through calm rather than spectacle. Historians still argue whether gardens were more effective diplomatic tools than court ceremonies, but many visitors wrote about them in lingering detail, suggesting they worked. You pass a small group standing slightly apart from the main path. Their clothing marks them as outsiders, different cuts, unfamiliar fabrics. They speak quietly among themselves, voices hushed, not out of respect alone, but uncertainty. One gestures toward a water channel, eyebrows raised, as if silently asking how it works. Another nods, pretending to understand. You suppress a smile. Everyone is a tourist somewhere. A quirky tidbit survives in several travel accounts. Some European visitors assumed Mughal gardens were purely decorative and were shocked to learn how intensively managed they were. One reportedly asked where the natural part of the garden was and received a polite, deeply confused response. Historians still argue how much these misunderstandings shaped foreign perceptions of Mughal culture, but moments like this suggest a gap that no guidebook could bridge. You continue walking, overhearing fragments of accented speech, admiration mixed with cautious interpretation. One visitor remarks on the symmetry, another on the scent, another on how quiet it is. Silence, it seems, is the most unsettling feature for those unused to it. The garden does not explain itself. It expects observation, not commentary. A Mughal court official passes nearby, posture relaxed but alert, eyes flicking briefly toward the visitors before moving on. This is hospitality with boundaries. Mainstream history notes that foreign guests were carefully managed, allowed access to certain spaces, while others remained off-limits. Historians still argue how much freedom visitors truly had, but the garden itself enforces limits gently. Paths lead where they are meant to lead. You pause near a reflecting pool as one visitor leans closer to the water, peering at his own distorted reflection. He straightens quickly when he realizes he's being watched, not reprimanded, just noticed. The garden does that. It reflects not only architecture and sky, but behavior. A fringe anecdote claims some envoys believed the garden was designed to test patience and restraint. Historians still argue whether that was intentional or simply a side effect of an unfamiliar pace. As you move on, the visitors fade behind you, their voices dissolving into the night. You're left again with the garden's quieter rhythms. The brief intrusion doesn't disrupt the calm, it highlights it. The garden absorbs difference without changing itself. You realize that for all its openness, this space belongs unmistakably to its culture. Visitors may walk its paths, admire its balance, drink its sherbets, but understanding it fully requires more than observation. It requires time, stillness, and a willingness to move slowly. You continue onward, leaving the visitors behind, carrying with you the sense that the garden has seen many eyes like theirs and yours, and remains serenely itself. As you walk farther in, a different kind of rhythm reaches you. Not water, not voices, but something measured and human. A call rises softly into the air, unhurried and melodic, then fades. It's answered somewhere else, not in competition, but completion. Evening prayer is beginning, and the garden adjusts itself around it. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Daily prayers structured life in the Mughal world, and gardens were not separate from religious routine. Whether near a mosque, a small prayer pavilion, or simply oriented toward the proper direction, devotion folded naturally into everyday spaces. Historians still argue whether gardens were designed with specific prayer acoustics or orientations in mind, but alignment mattered deeply in Mughal architecture. You slow and stand still, instinctively. No one asked you to, but the sound encourages pause. The sound isn't loud enough to dominate the garden, it weaves into it. Water continues to flow. Leaves continue to stir. The garden does not stop for prayer. It accommodates it. A quirky tidbit from court chronicles claims some emperors preferred to pray outdoors at dusk, believing the garden sharpened spiritual focus. Historians still argue whether this was genuine devotion or symbolic theater, but the habit existed. You notice small prayer mats being unrolled near a pavilion, movements efficient and practiced. Some people face away from you now, their attention turned elsewhere. Others simply stand quietly, listening. The garden becomes layered again, some participating, some observing, all sharing the same space without friction. The sound carries differently here, softened by trees and stone. It doesn't echo sharply, it settles. You realize the garden's acoustics make even spoken prayer feel intimate. Mainstream scholars note that Mughal architecture often favored sound diffusion over amplification. Historians still argue whether this was intentional design or fortunate consequence, but the result is a gentler auditory experience. You remain still, hands at your sides, breathing slow. Even as an outsider, you don't feel excluded. The prayer isn't performative, it's simply happening. The garden neither invites nor resists your presence, it just continues. As the final phrases fade, there's no abrupt return to activity. People linger a moment longer, as if allowing the air to settle again. Someone rolls a mat carefully, another adjusts a lantern wick. The transition back to evening life is seamless. You resume walking, aware that devotion here is not isolated to buildings or schedules. It lives alongside water channels, flowers, and paths. Historians still argue whether Mughal gardens were sacred spaces in themselves or merely adjacent to ritual. But after standing here, the distinction feels unnecessary. The garden accepts prayer the way it accepts dusk, quietly, inevitably, without comment. And you move on with that calm folded gently into you. You walk on as the sky completes its transformation, the last hints of color draining away until only deep blue remains. What replaces it is not darkness, but structure. The garden's architecture steps forward now, doing the quiet work it has been waiting all evening to do. Pavilions, arches, and colonnades begin to frame the night like deliberate sentences. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal garden architecture was designed to interact with light, both natural and artificial, using symmetry, open pavilions, and carefully placed openings to frame sky, water, and landscape. These structures were not merely decorative, they guided how space was perceived and experienced. Historians still argue whether architects prioritized visual symbolism over comfort, but standing here at night, you sense both were carefully balanced. You approach a marble pavilion set slightly above the surrounding paths. Its arches open in all directions, turning the space inside into a lens rather than a room. You step into it and the world reorganizes itself around you. Each arch captures a different slice of the garden. Water to the east, trees to the west, a long straight path to the north, shadowed planting beds to the south. You feel centered without trying. The pavilion floor is cool now, the day's heat fully released. You shift your weight and enjoy the sensation, aware that this cooling effect was part of the design. Mainstream sources note that marble and stone were chosen not only for beauty, but for how they behaved thermally. A quirky tidbit claims some builders tested stone slabs by sitting on them at night to judge comfort. Historians still argue whether that's true or just a charming story, but you approve of the methodology. You step back out, following the line of an arch that frames the sky perfectly. Stars appear neatly contained within its curve, as if placed there on purpose. Mughal architects loved this effect, turning infinite space into something manageable, even intimate. Historians still argue whether these alignments were astronomically precise or aesthetically intuitive, but the result feels intentional enough to trust. Farther along, a low colonnade guides your movement, its repeating pillars creating rhythm through repetition. Walking beside it, you feel time slow again, each step marked by shadow and light. The architecture doesn't rush you. It encourages measured progress, like a metronome set just below urgency. You notice how buildings never dominate the garden, they punctuate it. Each structure appears exactly where needed, then recedes, allowing water and plants to reclaim attention. This balance was central to Mughal design philosophy. Historians still argue whether gardens were meant to subordinate architecture or elevate it, but tonight they coexist comfortably. Lantern light flickers against carved stone, revealing patterns only at certain angles. You pause, watching shapes emerge and disappear as the flame shifts. This is architecture that rewards stillness. If you move too quickly, you miss it. You don't. You continue onward, guided by arches and openings that quietly point the way. The garden feels fully awake now, not through noise or activity, but through clarity. Everything is exactly where it should be, including you, moving calmly through a space designed to hold the night with grace. You begin to notice movement again, but this time it isn't careful or hushed. It's casual, almost indifferent to the rules that shape everything else here. Something darts across a path ahead of you, light-footed and unbothered, then disappears into shadow. A moment later, you see it clearly. A deer, pausing just long enough to decide you're not interesting. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens often allowed certain animals to roam freely, especially deer, peacocks, and occasionally antelope. These animals were symbols of grace and abundance, reinforcing the idea of the garden as a controlled version of nature rather than a purely artificial space. Historians still argue whether animals were introduced deliberately or simply encouraged to stay, but their presence was intentional enough to be maintained. The deer lifts its head, ears rotating lazily, then steps away, hooves barely making a sound on the packed earth. It doesn't hurry, it knows this place. You realize that for all the symmetry and planning, the garden tolerates a surprising amount of unpredictability. Animals are allowed to interrupt the geometry, to cross paths wherever they like. A quirky tidbit from court records suggests some gardeners complained constantly about deer eating prized plants, only to be told to plant more. Historians still argue whether this response reflected generosity or mild imperial indifference. You walk on, more alert now, scanning the darker corners between trees. A peacock emerges near a water channel, its silhouette unmistakable even without color. It steps carefully, testing the stone with one claw before committing. Peacocks were famously loud, but at night, they move like they know they've used up their allowance. You resist the urge to whisper, "Thank you." Animals shift the garden's energy. They break the illusion of total control just enough to keep it alive. Mainstream historians note that Mughal elites valued hunting as well as gardening, seeing both as ways to engage with nature on their own terms. Historians still argue whether gardens functioned as symbolic hunting grounds or merely as pleasant habitats, but tonight, the animals seem blissfully unconcerned with symbolism. You pass a cluster of trees where something rustles overhead, probably monkeys. You don't see them, and that's fine. Monkeys were frequent, unwanted guests in many Mughal gardens, tolerated with varying degrees of patience. A fringe anecdote claims some guards were assigned solely to shoo monkeys away from fruit trees. Historians still argue how effective that was, but the monkeys clearly still won sometimes. A pair of ducks glide across a rectangular pool, disturbing the water just enough to break the reflection of the stars. You watch the ripples spread, then fade. The garden doesn't correct them. Water channels exist to be used, even by creatures that don't care about design philosophy. You realize that animals experience the garden differently from humans. They don't follow paths. They don't pause at intersections. They don't admire symmetry. They simply move where it makes sense to them. And yet, the garden accommodates that movement without falling apart. This balance feels important. You continue walking, sharing the space now with quiet, breathing life that doesn't acknowledge emperors or architects. The garden feels fuller because of it, less like a display, more like a place. As you move on, you carry the comforting thought that perfection here always included a little tolerated chaos, and that might be why it still works. You hear it before you register it as poetry, a rhythm that isn't quite speech, not quite song. It floats across the water, slow and measured, as if the words themselves are taking their time. You follow the sound, steps light, until you find its source. A small group gathered near a long reflecting pool, their attention turned inward. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Poetry held immense cultural importance in the Mughal world, especially Persian verse, which was the language of courtly expression. Gardens were favored settings for composition and recitation, offering metaphors, moods, and sensory cues that shaped the work. Historians still argue whether gardens inspired poetry or poetry shaped how gardens were experienced, but here the two seem inseparable. One voice recites softly, careful not to disturb the night. The words drift across the pool, then return slightly altered, reflected by the water's surface. You don't catch every line, but you don't need to. The cadence carries meaning even without translation. A quirky tidbit preserved in literary histories claimed some poets tested verses by whispering them over water, believing reflections revealed flaws. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or poetic myth, but it's easy to imagine. You stand a little apart, listening. The pool mirrors lantern light and starlight, doubling everything: arches, trees, people. Poetry feels like the natural response to this doubling, a way of naming things twice. The garden doesn't interrupt. It seems to lean in. The recitation ends, and no one rushes to speak. Silence follows, intentional and respectful. This pause matters as much as the words. Mainstream scholarship notes that Mughal literary culture valued restraint and reflection. Historians still argue how much this culture filtered down beyond the elite, but moments like this suggest the ideal was widely understood. Another voice offers a line in response, not a critique, but an echo. The exchange is gentle, collaborative. You realize this isn't performance, it's conversation, slow and careful. The garden provides cover for vulnerability. Words spoken here don't have to defend themselves. You watch as someone dips fingers briefly into the pool, sending faint ripples outward. The reflection fractures, then reforms. The timing feels deliberate. You suspect it is. A fringe belief held that water listened to poetry and responded in kind. Historians still argue whether this belief was symbolic or sincerely held, but you appreciate the drama of it. You move on quietly, leaving the poets to their reflections. Their voices fade behind you, replaced once more by water and leaves. You carry the rhythm with you, feeling how it slows your steps, smooths your thoughts. The garden has given you another way to listen, not just to sound, but to meaning, unfolding at its own pace. And as you continue forward, poetry lingers in the air, unspoken but present, like the echo of water long after a stone has sunk. The darkness doesn't arrive all at once. It's managed. As you move forward, small points of light begin to appear, one by one, like careful decisions rather than reactions. Oil lamps glow softly along the paths, set low so they guide without glaring. The garden doesn't banish the night, it negotiates with it. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens used oil lamps, lanterns, and occasionally candles to illuminate evening spaces, with placement carefully considered to enhance safety and atmosphere. Lighting was never uniform. Instead, it was strategic, highlighting paths, water features, and pavilions while leaving other areas in shadow. Historians still argue whether this uneven lighting was purely practical or intentionally theatrical, but walking here, it feels thoughtfully restrained. You pass a servant kneeling to adjust a wick, coaxing the flame higher with practiced fingers. He shields it briefly from the breeze, then withdraws, leaving the lamp to do its quiet work. A quirky tidbit from period descriptions notes that certain oils were preferred for evening use because they burned cleaner and produced less smoke. Historians still argue how standardized these choices were, but the air here remains clear, unsullied by harsh smells. Light pools gently on the ground, stopping just short of the path's edge. Beyond it, shadows deepen, soft and indistinct. You feel no urge to step into them. The illuminated route is enough. This is guidance without force. Mainstream scholars note that Mughal design often balanced openness with subtle direction, encouraging movement without explicit barriers. Historians still argue whether this reflects broader imperial philosophy, but the parallel feels convincing. As you walk, lantern light catches carved details you missed earlier, floral motifs in stone, shallow reliefs along a low wall. These details were always there, but night reveals them differently. You lean closer, watching patterns emerge and fade as the flame flickers. The garden rewards patience again. A row of lamps lines the edge of a long water channel, their reflections stretching and trembling across the surface. Each flame doubles itself, then wavers. You slow to watch, feeling your thoughts mirror the same gentle instability. A fringe belief held that watching reflected fire calmed restless minds. Historians still argue whether this was documented practice or anecdotal wisdom, but you feel calmer all the same. Farther ahead, a pavilion glows faintly from within, its arches framing warm light against the dark. You approach, but don't enter, content to let the glow exist without you. The garden doesn't demand participation. Observation is enough. The lighting thins as you move on, lamps spaced farther apart now. Darkness fills the gaps, but it's never complete. You always see the next point of light, waiting. The effect is oddly reassuring. You're never lost, just gently guided forward. You realize how different this feels from modern lighting. No harsh brightness, no attempt to erase night entirely. This is illumination designed for human rhythm, not productivity. Historians still argue whether Mughal evenings were intentionally slowed by such choices, but walking here, you suspect the pace was part of the point. You continue along the softly lit path, your shadows stretching and shrinking with each step, until light and dark feel less like opposites and more like companions, carrying you deeper into the calm. As you move deeper into the garden, you become aware of something you felt all along but haven't quite named yet. You are not alone, and yet you are not being watched in any obvious way. The sensation is subtle, more like awareness than surveillance. The garden is secure, but it doesn't announce itself. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens, especially those attached to palaces or imperial residences, were carefully guarded spaces. Security was present but discreet, relying on controlled access points, strategic sightlines, and trusted personnel rather than visible force. Historians still argue whether this understated approach was intentional philosophy or simply practical necessity, but the effect is unmistakable. You pause near a path intersection and notice how it opens into multiple lines of sight. From here, anyone standing nearby could see you approach long before you noticed them. The garden itself does much of the work. A quirky tidbit recorded in later accounts claims some guards preferred garden duty because it required observation rather than confrontation. Historians still argue whether that preference was widespread, but you can understand the appeal. You catch a glimpse of movement near a colonnade, someone standing still enough to blend into shadow. Not hiding, just present. When you look directly, the figure shifts slightly, acknowledging your awareness without comment. There's no tension in the exchange, just confirmation. You continue walking, oddly reassured. Security here feels more like etiquette than enforcement. Paths funnel movement, walls define boundaries without looming. Lighting reveals what needs to be seen and leaves the rest alone. Mainstream historians note that Mughal court culture valued controlled visibility, knowing when to be seen and when not to be. Historians still argue whether gardens functioned as training grounds for this awareness, but walking here, you start to internalize it. You realize how little temptation there is to stray from the path, not because of fear, but because the path is pleasant. This is control achieved through comfort. A fringe anecdote suggests some architects believed people were easier to guide when they were content. Historians still argue whether this idea was consciously applied, but the garden makes a convincing case. As you move on, the sense of being held within a system remains, light but firm. You are free to walk, to pause, to linger, but always within a space that knows where you are. It's a strange comfort, like being trusted and supervised at the same time. You take a breath and continue, aware that the garden has quietly accepted responsibility for you tonight, guiding you safely onward without ever raising its voice. You begin to sense time stretching beyond this evening, as if the garden itself is remembering other versions of the same hour. The air carries a different weight now, not just night, but season. Even standing still, you can imagine how this place shifts across the year, rehearsing the same geometry under changing skies. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens were designed with seasons in mind, planted and structured to transform throughout the year. Flowering cycles, water flow, shade, and use of space all shifted with temperature and rainfall. Historians still argue whether these seasonal changes were meticulously planned or managed more reactively, but adaptability was built into the design. You walk past trees whose leaves rustle differently than they would in spring, thicker now, heavier. You imagine them bare in winter, branches turning the garden into something more skeletal, more architectural. A quirky tidbit from court chronicles notes that some emperors preferred gardens in winter when structure outweighed color. Historians still argue whether this was aesthetic preference or simply comfort-driven, but the idea lingers as you look at the trees differently. You picture the same water channels during monsoon season, fuller and louder, demanding more attention. Tonight, they are restrained, controlled. The garden adjusts itself without losing identity. Mainstream historians note that drainage systems were as important as irrigation, preventing flooding while maintaining visual order. Historians still argue how often these systems failed, but when they worked quietly, like tonight. You pause near a patch of ground where the soil feels softer underfoot. In another season, this might be planted differently. Beds rotate, flowers change. Even pathways subtly evolve as repairs are made. The garden is never static, despite appearances. A fringe belief held that gardens, like people, aged gracefully if allowed to change gradually. Historians still argue whether this philosophy guided maintenance or emerged as justification after the fact. You realize that this evening you're walking through only one version of the garden, a single performance in a long cycle. Others have walked here under spring blossoms, summer heat, winter chill. The geometry remains, but the experience shifts. That continuity feels grounding. You continue onward, aware that the garden carries not just the calm of this night, but echoes of many others, layered gently beneath your steps, ready to surface whenever you slow down enough to feel them. You notice something now that has been quietly present the entire time, the sense that nothing here is allowed to drift for long. Leaves fall, water flows, animals wander, people come and go, but the garden never feels neglected. Someone is always tending to it, even when you don't see them. Maintenance here is not background work, it is authority made subtle. A mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. Mughal gardens required constant, organized upkeep, funded and supervised by the state or imperial household. Maintenance schedules, water regulation, replanting, and repairs were all part of an ongoing system. Historians still argue whether garden upkeep was seen primarily as practical necessity or as an expression of imperial power, but the resources devoted to it suggest both. You stop near a stone edge where the path meets a planting bed. The line between them is crisp, unbroken. Someone trimmed this recently. You can tell. This precision isn't vanity, it's message. Order is being maintained. The empire is functioning. A quirky tidbit from administrative records suggests garden conditions were sometimes used as indicators of local governance quality. Historians still argue whether this was formal policy or informal judgment, but a neglected garden would not have gone unnoticed. You walk on, noticing small repairs done so carefully they barely register. A stone reset, a channel cleared, a joint smoothed over. These are not grand renovations, they are quiet corrections. The garden does not wait for things to break dramatically. It prevents failure through attention, power expressed through prevention rather than reaction. This kind of maintenance shapes behavior. You find yourself stepping more carefully, almost out of respect. Mainstream historians note that Mughal imperial culture valued visible stability. Gardens reinforced this by appearing timeless, even though they required constant intervention. Historians still argue whether the illusion of permanence was intentional propaganda, but illusions work best when they're well maintained. You imagine the administrative structure behind this calm. Requests filed, workers assigned, material sourced, all invisible now, but once very real. The garden is beautiful, yes, but it is also bureaucracy rendered gentle. A fringe observation from later commentators claimed Mughal gardens felt too perfect to be accidental. Historians still argue whether perfection was truly achieved or simply perceived, but perception carries its own weight. You move forward with a new awareness. This serenity is not passive, it is enforced softly through daily effort and expectation. The garden doesn't just soothe, it persuades. It tells you without words that things are under control. And somehow, that makes it easier to relax. You hear laughter before you see its source. Light, unguarded, and just a little too loud for court etiquette. It cuts through the garden's careful calm like a skipped stone across water. You follow the sound and find it tucked between hedges and a low wall, a space deliberately set slightly apart. This is where the rules loosen, just enough. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Children of the Mughal imperial family spent significant time in palace gardens, which were considered safe, instructive environments for play and early education. Tutors, attendants, and guards hovered nearby, but within boundaries, children were allowed a degree of freedom. Historians still argue how sheltered imperial children truly were, but gardens clearly played a role in shaping their early experiences. You spot them. Two children chasing each other along a narrow path, robes gathered clumsily in their hands. They aren't fast, but they're enthusiastic. One stumbles, recovers, and laughs harder for it. An attendant watches from a distance, pretending not to, which might be the most skilled performance you've seen all evening. The children dart around a small tree, turning it into a fortress, then a hiding place, then something to lean on dramatically while catching their breath. The garden accommodates this reinterpretation without complaint. A quirky tidbit from court memoirs suggests imperial children invented elaborate games based on garden features, assigning roles to fountains and trees. Historians still argue how much of this play was spontaneous versus gently guided, but the joy looks real enough. You pause, careful not to intrude. There's something grounding about seeing children here, proof that this space wasn't reserved solely for symbolism and control. It was lived in. Mainstream historians note that Mughal education emphasized discipline, but also exposure to art, nature, and language from an early age. The garden quietly supported all three. One child stops and looks toward the water channel, considering something deeply important. He tosses a pebble, watches it sink, then looks up, satisfied. No philosophical conclusion follows. Sometimes a pebble is just a pebble. You respect that. The laughter fades as the children are gently redirected toward a pavilion, bedtime approaching, probably. They don't resist much. The garden has tired them out in the best way. You watch them go, feeling the space grow quieter again. As you continue walking, you carry that sound with you, faint but lingering. It softens the garden's authority, reminding you that even here, amidst order and symbolism, life unfolded messily, joyfully, and briefly, without concern for legacy. You walk on with the echo of laughter fading behind you, and the garden seems to draw inward again, returning to its more contemplative rhythm. The paths straighten, the plantings become more deliberate, and the balance between order and wildness sharpens. This is where the garden quietly explains itself, without words, without instruction. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens were deeply influenced by philosophical ideas about humanity's relationship with nature. Rather than preserving wilderness, these gardens aimed to refine it, shaping natural elements into harmonious order. Historians still argue whether this philosophy was primarily inherited from Persian traditions or developed uniquely in the Mughal context, but the emphasis on controlled nature is unmistakable. You stop near a tree whose branches have been trained carefully, not forced, into a graceful spread. Someone guided this growth years ago, maybe decades. The tree complied, more or less. This feels like the garden's central metaphor. Nature is not conquered here, it is persuaded. A quirky tidbit from horticultural writings suggests some gardeners believed plants responded better to gentle pruning than aggressive cutting. Historians still argue whether this belief had practical merit or simply reflected aesthetic preference, but the results speak quietly for themselves. You notice how water is never allowed to flood or disappear. It flows where it is told, but it is never hidden. Plants are lush, but not tangled. Animals are present, but not dominant. Everything exists within limits that feel intentional rather than oppressive. The garden doesn't celebrate chaos, but it doesn't eliminate it either. It edits. This balance reflects a broader Mughal worldview. Mainstream historians note that Mughal rulers often presented themselves as just administrators of a complex world, not its creators. Gardens echoed this image, spaces where ideal order could exist temporarily, visibly, and reassuringly. Historians still argue whether this was sincere belief or political narrative, but as you stand here, the distinction feels academic. You walk along a path where grass meets stone in a perfectly measured line. Someone decided exactly where that boundary should be. You realize how many decisions are embedded in every step: what grows, what doesn't, what stays visible, what recedes. The garden is opinionated but polite about it. A breeze moves through again, carrying leaves across the path. No one rushes to remove them. Some imperfection is tolerated. The garden doesn't panic over disorder, it corrects gently over time. A fringe belief held that excessive tidiness invited imbalance. Historians still argue whether this belief influenced maintenance practices or simply justified occasional neglect, but the restraint feels deliberate. You continue forward, understanding now that this place is not about nature as it is, nor about control for its own sake. It's about relationship. The garden exists in dialogue with water, plants, animals, people, and time. And as you move through it, you are part of that dialogue too, briefly shaping and being shaped in return. You sense a subtle shift as you move onward, a feeling that the garden is both present and already slipping into memory. The paths remain smooth, the water still flows, the lamps continue their steady glow. But something about the air suggests impermanence, not decay exactly, more like anticipation of change. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Many Mughal gardens experienced periods of neglect, repair, and reinvention over the centuries, shaped by shifting political fortunes, environmental pressures, and changing tastes. Few gardens remained frozen in their original form. Historians still argue whether later alterations preserved or diluted original intent, but transformation was inevitable. You pause near a stone edge where faint cracks run like thin lines in old skin. They've been filled, smoothed, and disguised, but not erased. This garden has been repaired before. It will be repaired again. A quirky tidbit from later colonial-era records suggests some repair crews tried to improve Mughal gardens by simplifying layouts, often misunderstanding their purpose. Historians still argue whether these changes caused permanent loss or merely added another layer to the garden's story. You imagine this same path years from now, perhaps quieter, perhaps louder, perhaps walked by different kinds of feet. Empires fade, gardens adapt, water channels silt up, then are cleared, trees die and are replaced. The geometry persists longer than the people who designed it, but not forever. This doesn't make the garden sad, it makes it honest. You move along a path where one side feels slightly uneven. Someone has compensated for shifting ground, adjusting stones to maintain the illusion of stability. Maintenance continues, but it's always catching up to time. Mainstream historians note that even at their height, Mughal gardens required constant negotiation with climate and wear. Historians still argue whether the effort was always worth it, but the persistence itself became part of the meaning. You stop near a water channel where the flow sounds a little different, slower, softer, as if tired. You wonder how many hands have adjusted this channel, how many decisions were made quietly to keep it going. A fringe belief held that water remembered its original path and resisted change. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor or misunderstanding, but listening now, you feel the weight of repetition. The garden doesn't hide its age completely. Lantern light reveals softened edges, worn steps, places where time has brushed against intention. And yet, it remains beautiful, maybe because of that. Perfection here was never about permanence, it was about renewal. You continue walking, aware that you're part of the garden's long afterlife, a temporary witness in a space that has already outlasted countless evenings like this one, and will continue to change long after you leave. You slow again, not because the path demands it, but because your thoughts have grown heavier, fuller. The garden seems to notice. It offers you a long, straight stretch, bordered by low hedges and evenly spaced lamps, a place designed for walking and thinking at the same time. This feels like the garden's most reflective hour. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Mughal gardens have long been the subject of scholarly debate, interpreted variously as symbols of paradise, expressions of imperial control, sites of leisure, or complex blends of all three. Historians still argue whether these gardens were meant primarily to project power or to provide genuine personal refuge for their patrons. Walking here now, the answer refuses to settle into a single shape. You consider how carefully everything has been arranged: the water, the plants, the views, the movement of people and animals, and yet how lived in it feels. This duality fuels debate. One school of thought emphasizes symbolism, four-part layouts, cosmic order, divine authority rendered in stone and leaf. Another points to diaries, letters, and practical records that describe gardens as places of rest, family life, and quiet routine. Historians still argue which interpretation should dominate, or whether insisting on dominance misses the point entirely. You pass a spot where the path widens slightly, as if inviting pause. You stop, hands loosely clasped, and look around. Nothing dramatic happens. No revelation arrives, and somehow that feels appropriate. Perhaps the garden was never meant to be solved. A quirky tidbit from later academic debates suggests some scholars believed Mughal gardens were intentionally ambiguous, resisting singular meaning. Historians still argue whether that ambiguity was deliberate or simply the result of layered use over time. You think about the people who walked here before you: emperors, gardeners, poets, children, visitors who misunderstood, and locals who didn't bother explaining. Each would have carried a different interpretation, shaped by position and mood. The garden held them all without correcting anyone. It didn't insist on being read correctly. As you resume walking, you realize the garden encourages this openness. It offers structure, but not conclusions. You can admire the engineering, feel the calm, question the power dynamics, or simply enjoy the night air. None of these responses are wrong. The garden accommodates them all. Historians still argue because the garden still invites argument. It hasn't resolved itself into a museum piece or a single narrative. Even now, it remains active, shaping experience rather than delivering answers. That may be its most enduring feature. You take a final look down the illuminated path, feeling the gentle accumulation of everything you've noticed tonight. The debates fade into the background, not dismissed, just softened. The garden doesn't demand interpretation. It allows it, then lets you move on. You reach the far end of the garden almost without realizing it. There's no gate announcing the transition, no sign to mark completion. The space simply opens, wider and quieter than before, as if the garden is exhaling after holding your attention all evening. Night has fully settled now, confident and unhurried. A mainstream historical fact anchors this final stretch. Mughal gardens were often designed with terminal vistas, open ends that framed sky, river, or distant landscape, allowing the mind to drift outward after moving through structured space. Historians still argue whether these endings were meant to symbolize return to the world beyond imperial order or simply provide visual relief, but they feel intentional all the same. You stop at the edge of a low terrace and look back. From here, the paths you followed are no longer obvious. Lamps mark only fragments. Water sounds blend into a single, gentle presence. The garden has already begun to release you. A quirky tidbit from later accounts suggests some visitors felt disoriented leaving Mughal gardens, as if time resumed too quickly. Historians still argue whether this reaction was common or romanticized, but you understand the feeling. You turn forward again, facing darkness that feels less structured, more open. The garden behind you holds its form, but it no longer asks anything of you. You've walked its lines, listened to its water, breathed its air. It has done its work. Your steps slow naturally. You're no longer observing details. You're simply moving, breathing, existing. The garden has shifted from experience to memory while you're still inside it. This is its final gesture, letting go. You take one last breath of cool night air, and the scents are simpler now. Less flower, more earth. Less design, more quiet. The symmetry fades, replaced by a soft, continuous dark. You feel grounded, settled, gently emptied of the day. And as you stand there, on the edge between garden and night, everything softens just a little more. The sounds grow farther apart now, stretched by distance and calm. Water becomes a low, steady murmur. Leaves move lazily, without urgency. Even your thoughts begin to slow, lining up less sharply, drifting instead of insisting. The garden doesn't follow you forward, but it doesn't disappear either. It lingers, like warmth held in stone long after sunset. You imagine lying down somewhere nearby, the night air brushing lightly over you, the garden still breathing in the background. There's nothing left to notice, nothing left to do. The paths have ended, and so has the need to walk them. So you let your shoulders drop. You let your jaw unclench. You let the quiet carry you just a little farther, until the edges of the garden blur completely into rest. Now everything slows even more. Sentences stretch. Thoughts thin out. The garden is no longer something you move through. It becomes something you float beside, like a calm memory replaying itself more softly each time. Water, stone, night air, distant lamps. All of it fades gently, without effort, without farewell. You are safe. You are comfortable. Nothing is expected of you now. Hey guys, tonight we slip through a sandstone gateway just as the sun lowers itself behind mango trees and marble pavilions, and you find yourself standing inside a Mughal garden at sunset. Cool air, long shadows, and the quiet realization that, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this lifestyle without complaining about the insects. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake somewhere in the world right now, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward, sandals brushing over a path of compacted earth edged with red sandstone. The heat of the day still lingers low, like it's forgotten it's supposed to leave, but the air has softened. This is the hour Mughal gardens were made for. Historians agree that these gardens reached their peak during the reigns of emperors like Babur and Shah Jahan, blending Persian design ideals with the realities of the Indian climate. One mainstream fact you can anchor yourself to is that Mughal gardens were not casual green spaces. They were deliberate political and spiritual statements designed to reflect paradise as described in Islamic texts. You don't rush. No one does here, at least not at this hour. The garden seems to instruct you to slow down, gently but firmly, like a hand on your shoulder. You notice the way the paths divide evenly, crossing at right angles. Even without knowing the term charbagh, your body understands the symmetry. 4 parts, 4 directions, order imposed on the wild urge of plants to grow wherever they please. Historians still argue whether this rigid geometry was more about spiritual symbolism or imperial control, but as you walk, it mostly feels calming, like the world briefly makes sense. To your left, water murmurs. Not a dramatic fountain yet, just a narrow channel, its surface catching the last orange light of the sun. The sound is soft enough that you almost miss it, which is the point. Mughal engineers were famously skilled at hydraulic design, using gravity-fed systems to move water long distances without pumps. A quirky tidbit you might enjoy as you wander: some garden channels were angled so precisely that the water would ripple just enough to cool the air, but not enough to splash. Ancient air conditioning minus the electric bill. You pause near the entrance pavilion and glance back once, instinctively, as if someone would stop you. No guard does. Security exists here, but it's subtle. That's for later. For now, the garden accepts you. The light is fading quickly, turning white marble faintly blue, then gray. You hear distant voices, low and unhurried, and the occasional cough that echoes longer than expected. Sound behaves differently in a space designed to carry poetry, not traffic. As you walk deeper, scent becomes more noticeable than sight. Warm earth, crushed leaves, something floral you can't immediately name. Roses were popular here, of course, but not just for looking at. Mainstream history tells us roses were cultivated extensively for making attar, a concentrated perfume oil. The quirky part is that some gardeners swore certain rose varieties smelled stronger after sunset, leading to selective nighttime harvesting. Historians still argue whether this belief had a botanical basis or was simply confirmation bias paired with tired noses. You shift your weight, feeling the faint ache of standing all day, except you haven't. The garden makes you aware of your body in small ways. The path is even, but not smooth. Pebbles press gently into your soles. Somewhere nearby, a peacock calls, the sound oddly mournful, like it forgotten what it wanted to say halfway through. Peacocks, by the way, were often kept semi-free in Mughal gardens. Not pets exactly, more like tolerated residents. One chronicler complained they screamed too much at night, which feels relatable. You pass a low wall and notice how it frames the horizon. This is intentional. Mughal architects loved controlled views, windows, arches, and openings that turned the landscape into something like a painting. Even now, with the sun almost gone, the sky appears carefully placed. Orange fades into purple, purple into a soft, indecisive blue. Historians still argue whether garden designers worked closely with astronomers to align these views with celestial events, or if that's us projecting modern romanticism backward. There's a bench ahead, stone and cool, and you sit without ceremony. Somewhere unseen, gardeners are finishing their work, sweeping paths, closing small sluice gates. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that maintaining these gardens required a permanent workforce. This wasn't passive beauty, it was labor-intensive, seasonal, and continuous. A fringe tidbit whispers that some gardeners believed the plants listened, and that harsh words spoken near flowers could stunt growth. So, work ended quietly at dusk, when voices naturally softened. You lean back slightly and look up. tree canopies overlap just enough to break the sky into manageable pieces. Bats flicker through the air, efficient and silent, doing the real work of insect control. No one comments on them. You appreciate that. The garden isn't trying to impress you anymore. The daytime visitors are gone. This hour belongs to those who stay. A breeze moves through, bringing with it the faint clink of water touching stone. You realize you're smiling, faintly, without meaning to. This place does that. It's designed to. Whether as propaganda, prayer, or pleasure, the Mughal garden succeeds by slowing you down. Historians still argue whether emperors experienced these spaces as spiritual retreats or as stages for power, but sitting here, you suspect the answer was probably both, depending on the day. You stand again, unhurried, and continue inward as the last edge of sun slips away completely. The garden doesn't end at the gate, it deepens. And you follow, because at this pace, there's nowhere else you need to be.